He promised reform. He delivered power. But behind the flashbulbs and speeches, something darker was already taking root. In the glittering halls of French politics, few names shine as brightly. Charismatic, ambitious, and unapologetically bold, Sarkozy rocketed to power in 2007 on a wave of populist energy and political skill. But beneath the surface of campaign rallies and press coverage lay a network of financial dealings, secret donors, and blurred ethical lines that would later haunt not just his legacy, but the French Republic itself. This is the story of how one man's unstoppable rise sowed the seeds of his own political downfall. The meteoric rise. Born in 1955 to a Hungarian immigrant father and a French mother, Nicolas Sarkozy's ascent through the political ranks was anything but accidental. He was driven, relentless, and politically astute. By the time he became Interior Minister in 2002 under President Jacques Chirac, Sarkozy was already crafting a larger-than-life persona, one that would polarize the country and dominate its media. By 2007, he was ready for the presidency. At the time, French law capped campaign financing, limiting the amount presidential candidates could legally spend. The structure of this dual accounting system would only come to light years later, but its roots were in place from the beginning. Running on a platform of security, economic reform, and national pride, Sarkozy galvanized the French right and appealed to the center with his energy and decisiveness. The firm organized rallies, created media content, and ran logistics. He took a hard stance on immigration, strengthened ties with the U.S., and tried to modernize France's labor laws. But his methods sparked protests, and his approval ratings began to slip. On paper, all expenses were accounted for, but, in reality, things were beginning to spiral. But all of it came at a cost financially and ethically. The press couldn't get enough of him. Dubbed the Bling, President Sarkozy became a magnet for attention, fashion, and controversy. Sarkozy was elected with over 53% of the vote, defeating socialist rival Ségolène Royal. He celebrated his win with a dinner at a luxury restaurant in Paris, further cementing his image as a leader more in touch with elites than ordinary citizens. But the spotlight also had its shadows. His campaign, which many described as one of the most expensive and sophisticated in French history, raised eyebrows for its spending. But what happens when the courts finally catch up to the campaign trail? Behind the scenes, insiders were already whispering about irregularities. Unemployment remained high, and his reforms had alienated unions and leftist voters. What they found would eventually lead to the unraveling of the Bygmalion affair. He lost his bid for re-election to François Hollande. But it wasn't just politics that ended, as President said. Was the legal storm gathering behind him. The Bygmalion communications agency, founded by close Sarkozy allies, was hired to manage large portions of his campaign strategy. Behind closed doors, invoices were allegedly being duplicated, hidden, or reassigned to the party's books to keep Sarkozy's official campaign spending under the legal threshold. Dozens of fake invoices were traced back to Bygmalion and two key members of Sarkozy's campaign team. Was it carelessness? Was it deliberate fraud? Or simply a system corrupted by ambition? Meanwhile, Sarkozy's style of politics, combative, media-driven, hyperactive, was reshaping the French presidency. Still, his campaign juggernaut remained unmatched. Massive rallies, glossy media packages, and a digital operation ahead of its time gave him an edge. What if the very machine that won you power was the same one that would one day send you to court? In retrospect, the cracks were already visible. But in 2007, few were asking the tough questions. It was the beginning of what critics would call the presidency of appearances. By 2012, Sarkozy was facing growing public discontent. As early as 2014, journalists and investigators began probing his 2012 campaign spending. Auditors discovered that the party's event spending had more than doubled the legal limits, with false billing used to hide the overspending. Though Sarkozy initially denied knowledge, investigators began linking his name to internal communications that suggested he was kept informed. The former president's greatest asset's image was now becoming his biggest liability. The story of Nicolas Sarkozy is not just one of personal ambition but of how political systems can be broken and ultimately exposed. Imagine being the former president of France then, finding yourself in a courtroom, not as a witness of history, but as a defendant fighting for your freedom. It was a trial unlike any other in modern French history. For the first time, a former head of state stood in front of a judge to answer for his role in a campaign financing scandal that had haunted the Republic for nearly a decade. What unfolded wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a reckoning with power, influence, and the rule of law in one of the world's oldest democracies. In the years following Sarkozy's failed re-election bid in 2012, France's campaign finance watchdog the CNCCFPR raised red flags about unexplained expenses. By 2014, formal investigations were opened into the Union for a popular movement, Sarkozy's political party. The allegations, systematic overspending, fake invoices, and illegal campaign financing, investigators discovered that the public relations firm managing Sarkozy's campaign events had billed nearly 18.5 million euros worth of expenses to the UMP rather than to the campaign itself, disguising costs that should have counted towards Sarkozy's legal spending limit of 22.5 million euros. By the end of 2012, Sarkozy's campaign had allegedly spent nearly 43 million euros, almost double the legal limit. The scale of the fraud was staggering. Dozens of party officials, accountants, and Bygmalion executives were implicated. Some cooperated with prosecutors, exposing the elaborate schemes used to bypass France's strict campaign finance laws. In March 2021, after years of legal delays, Nicolas Sarkozy became the first former French president to physically appear in court on criminal charges related to campaign financing. The courtroom was packed with journalists, lawyers, and political observers. The mood was electric. The charges: illegal campaign financing, punishable by up to 1 year in prison and a fine of 3,750 euros. These demands, they said, created pressure to hide the costs in creative and illegal ways. Sarkozy, ever composed, denied all wrongdoing. He claimed he had no knowledge of the accounting manipulations and placed the blame squarely on party administrators in the Bygmalion firm. But the prosecution presented a compelling timeline, supported by documents, testimonies, and email records. And while Sarkozy may not have directly approved the invoice fraud, prosecutors argued he could not have been unaware of what was happening. Several key witnesses testified that Sarkozy demanded ever larger campaign events, pushing the team to organize grander rallies across France. "We were organizing 2 events a day, sometimes more," one campaign manager said. There was no way to stay within budget. The trial revealed a culture of excess, a presidential machine so obsessed with optics and momentum that budgetary rules became secondary. Prosecutors wiretapped Sarkozy's private conversations with his lawyer, revealing discussions about offering a prestigious job in Monaco to a judge in exchange for leaked legal information. While the Bygmalion trial was underway, Sarkozy was also entangled in another legal bombshell: the corruption and influence peddling case involving an attempt to bribe a judge. In this separate case, Sarkozy was accused of attempting to secure confidential information about an ongoing investigation into his finances. For others, it felt like a political vendetta against a polarizing figure. How could a man who once promised to cleanse France of corruption end up convicted in 2 separate trials? The court allowed him to serve the remaining year under house arrest with an electronic bracelet. Meanwhile, legal scholars debated the implications of jailing a former president. Was the French legal system setting a new standard or crossing a dangerous line? He launched an appeal, maintaining his innocence and vowing to fight until the end. In interviews, he painted himself as a victim of judicial overreach and selective justice. Those hopes evaporated overnight. Could this mark the end of political impunity in France? Just months later in September, he was convicted in the Bygmalion case as well, and sentenced to an additional 1 year in prison. The use of secret wiretaps sparked controversy in France, with critics arguing it violated attorney-client. But the courts ruled that the evidence was admissible and devastating. Sarkozy became the first post-war French president to be convicted and sentenced to prison. In segment 3, Legacy on Trial, the political cost of corruption in France, we'll explore how Sarkozy's downfall has reshaped French politics, challenged public faith in democracy, and exposed the true cost of unchecked power. In March 2021, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with 2 suspended, 2 trials, 2 convictions, 1 former president. The French public was sharply divided. For some, the verdicts symbolized a long overdue moment of justice. French conservatives rallied behind Sarkozy, calling the investigations excessive and politically motivated, but public trust in institutions had been damaged. Sarkozy's conviction stunned the political establishment. He had been quietly maneuvering for a return to politics, mentoring young leaders, and testing the waters for a potential comeback. France's right wing was left without a unifying figure. As one columnist wrote, "France no longer protects its kings." But Sarkozy, true to form, did not fade quietly. The appeals process is still ongoing, and while he remains free under house arrest, the shadow of prison looms. The court may have spoken, but the debate is far from over. What happens when justice finally catches up with power? Does it restore public faith or expose how fragile democracy really is? In the aftermath of Nicolas Sarkozy's convictions, France found itself at a crossroads. The image of a former president being sentenced to prison rattled the foundations of its political establishment and sent ripples far beyond the walls of the courtroom. But what truly changed in the Republic of France and what stayed the same? This segment unpacks the long-term political, social, and international consequences of Sarkozy's fall from grace. Even more troubling, younger voters expressed deep skepticism about the justice system's willingness or ability to pursue those in power. The Bygmalion and bribery scandals did not merely damage Sarkozy's reputation, they dealt a serious blow to the public's perception of political integrity in France. Citizens who once believed in the impartiality and strength of democratic institutions began to question whether elites could ever truly be held accountable. His convictions effectively ended any possibility of a political comeback and left a vacuum in conservative leadership. Polls conducted in 2021 revealed that over 64% of French voters believed corruption among top politicians was widespread. Former allies of Sarkozy distanced themselves from him publicly, but many continued to use his political strategies behind the scenes. If a president can manipulate judges, what hope do ordinary people have? One university student in Lyon asked. Although the judiciary had proven its independence by prosecuting a powerful figure, the trials simultaneously highlighted just how long such impunity can last before accountability catches up. He had campaigned on restoring trust in politics and ethical governance, but critics accused his administration of dragging its feet on transparency reforms. Campaign finance laws remain mostly unchanged, and political watchdog agencies continued to struggle with limited resources. Sarkozy had long been a kingmaker within the French Senate, especially in Les, the party that evolved from the UMP in Brazil. Former President Luiz Lula da Silva was jailed in 2018 for corruption only to have his convictions overturned and later returned to office. As the 2022 presidential election approached, Les struggled to field a viable candidate. Marine Le Pen's far-right national rally gained traction by exploiting the scandals. Meanwhile, in the United States, investigations into campaign violations and obstruction of justice under former President Donald Trump sparked heated debates about legal accountability versus political persecution. Her party's narrative that the French establishment was corrupt and broken resonated more than ever. In many ways, Sarkozy's fall didn't just weaken the center-right, it strengthened the populist fringe. For the French people, the image of Sarkozy in court, defiant and yet confined, lingers. For some, he is the charismatic modernizer who redefined France's role on the global stage. Power, accountability, and justice collided in a way that France will be reckoning with for years to come. For others, he is the embodiment of hubris, a politician who believed the rules didn't apply to him. Sarkozy's trials were meant to be a warning to those who abuse power. But did they accidentally empower those who reject the system altogether? For Emmanuel Macron, the sitting president during much of Sarkozy's legal drama, the situation was delicate. The Sarkozy case, while historic, did not lead to sweeping legislative change. He denied wrongdoing, emphasized his achievements, and portrayed the trials as political vengeance. The book became a bestseller. The result, a moment of reckoning, but not a movement. Sarkozy is K. Swazin. In South Korea, Park Geun-hye was impeached and sentenced to 24 years in prison for corruption, only to be pardoned after serving 5. France's prosecution of Sarkozy fits within a broader global trend. Democratic societies, struggling to hold their most powerful citizens to account without appearing partisan or vindictive. The legacy of Sarkozy's conviction is now part of a larger conversation, one that asks whether democracy can survive corruption from the top. Despite his legal defeat, Sarkozy remains a deeply polarizing figure. His memoirs, released post-conviction, sought to reframe his legacy. But legacy is not only written in court documents or personal reflections, it is shaped by public memory. The real verdict may not be written in legal history but in political culture. Nicolas Sarkozy's story is not just a tale of ambition gone to far. It's a mirror held up to a democracy grappling with its ideals. If you found this series insightful, don't forget to subscribe to State Affairs Review, where we unravel the stories behind global power struggles, political downfalls, and what they mean for the future of democracy. Comment below. Do you believe democratic systems are truly capable of holding their leaders accountable, or are we witnessing justice only when it's convenient? Thanks for watching.